back for the two. Can somebody come in and do one of those little things like that?
Well, you just did it because you're on.
This is the second lecture in Introduction to Literature. In order to follow it, you should have several things. First, a sheet with all of the terms from poetry on it. A is Cadman, B is Anglo-Saxon tradition, C is classical tradition. You should also have Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, a poem. A mimeograph sheet on which there are 3 poems, which has John Donne at the top. The first poem is John Donne's song, Go and Catch a Falling Star. You should also have the Invention of New Jersey, another poem, which begins, place a custard stand in a garden, or in place of a custard stand, place a tumble-down custard stand. And another poem, It's Hard to Be Hip Over 30. It's by Judith Bjorst, and it's out of a book of poems called It's Hard to Be Hip Over 30, Another Tragedy of Married Life. And a 5th poem, Ars Poetica by Archibald MacLeish. Now the terms, as you see, we get some practice filling them in, and I'll try to go through them pretty much in order, and where I can refer to the poems that you have in your hand to show some examples of the different terms. The first several weeks is really, for some of you, going to be a review, because what we'll be doing is going over the terms again of each individual genre and learning to apply those terms. We won't really get to the real hardcore analysis of poems and stories and so on until we move towards the second half of the semester. This is really the background material that I assume everybody will need. And as I had said, some of it will be old hat to you. You've already seen a lot of it. Now the first term is a very important one, and that is the differences in words. The literal dictionary definition of the word is the word's denotation. You can see it up there under I. Every word has a couple sets of meanings, and they, of course, tie back into the right and left hemisphere of the brain. The denotative meaning is the left-brained meaning, the literal dictionary definition of the word. This contrasts with number 2 there, the shade of meaning words have acquired through association and use. You can see how association, which is primarily a right hemisphere function, would function in the selection of the connotated words on the basis of their connotative meaning. Every time a poet comes to choose his words, which if you look down to number 7, the answer for number 7, the words that the poet chooses out of all the words he could have used is his diction. His diction is chosen for a lot of different reasons, but quite often the distinction between taking one word and taking another is the difference between its connotative meanings. If you have 2 possible words you could use in a given place, and you choose one of them because of the associations that it has. For example, woman and broad both have the same denotative meaning. They have entirely different connotations. If you say that someone was a woman, they won't be upset with you. But if you say that broad over there, then there are connotations to that. That's kind of the associations with broad is sort of a low-life, lower-class kind of woman who's of generally easy virtue. And so that may not be as much of an insult as it was at one time. But in any case, it's the connotative, the associated meanings of the words, which would make the poet make the choice of words that he makes. And that's one of the most important choices that a poet has to make in creating his poetry, is deciding which words to use out of all the possible words that could be used. That's probably one of the main differences between poetry and prose. Not that there isn't a lot of selection of words in prose, but in poetry, the selection has to be a lot more precise. One of the chief differences between a poem, if you look at any of those poems there that you have, one of the ways that you can tell this is a poem is that the lines don't run all the way across the page. That's prose. Also, there are a lot fewer words than on a page full of prose. Where things are broken up into paragraphs, they're not necessarily broken up into paragraphs the way a prose piece of work would be broken up. So the form of poetry in itself the outer shape of poetry is a way to make a distinction between the two. And the fact that there aren't so many words used indicates that poetry has to be better than prose in its selection of words, because it hasn't got as many words to play around with as prose has. Compression of language. Picking out the one word that fits perfectly in that position. If you've only got, let's say there are 100, maybe 200 words at the most in some of these poems, to be able to capture the complete essence of a situation in that few words, you've got to be very, very precise in your choice of diction. A prose writer has got anywhere from, say, 5,000 to 50,000, 150,000 words to deal with to get their point across. They can afford not to be precise, because the longer a prose work is, the more words you have, the more opportunities you have to say a thing, and then say it again in a slightly different way, and again in a slightly different way from that. But in poetry, you've got to get it in its best possible form the first time. Now, poets do a lot of revising of their poems. Poems go through, like prose also, goes through a number of drafts. Probably not anywhere near the amount of drafts that poetry goes through. McClish, who did Ars Poetica, I believe, is the one who... There's an anecdote about him. He was a house guest, one of the mansions. McClish traveled in a higher class of society than I traveled in. In any case, he was there as a house guest, and he never came down before noon. Then he'd come down and eat lunch, and he'd go back up, and then he wouldn't come back down again from his room until 6 o'clock. So one of the other people who was a house guest there said, "Mr. McClish, what do you do up there all day?" And he said, "Well, I got up about 6, and between 6 o'clock and noon, I put in a semicolon. And between noon and 6, I took it back out again." And he wasn't entirely kidding. A poet would spend 6 hours puzzling over the punctuation, for example, in a poem. A semicolon in a poem gives you a certain kind of pause. If it's not there, you get a different kind of pause. The musical quality of poetry makes those pauses of very great importance, much more important than they'd be to a prose writer. A prose writer likes to get some rhythms into his work, and as when we get to some of the prose writers, you'll see that their styles vary, and their rhythms of these words as they flow out are going to vary. But the rhythms are not nearly as important as they are to a poet. So pauses are crucial. Poets will often revise poems, sometimes years or even decades after a poem has been out and accepted. I think probably later on in the course we'll probably do a poem or two by Whitman. And Whitman really only wrote 3 books of poetry in his life, but he wrote one book 5 different times. It was one long collection of poems. And the first time he put it out, it got a lot of critical acclaim. And he still changed it. He rewrote poems that critics had said were wonderful poems. He took poems out that he didn't like anymore. He put different poems back in, and he did this 5 different times during his life. Keats revised a number of his poems after they had been out and been given acceptance. And most of the revision is going after that perfect word, or that perfect sequence of words. Sometimes the changes that a poet makes aren't immediately apparent. They look like they're little changes. But to the poet, they really loom large. Just a little thing like putting a semicolon in or not putting a semicolon in is crucial. And again, sometimes a poem has to be revised because of the denotation and connotation. Sometimes the connotations of a word change. Sometimes even the denotations change. For example, the word nice, which once meant a very trivial detail of a thing. So a nice distinction was a very fine distinction, a very precise distinction. Whereas now we use nice as a kind of general term of approval. So the entire denotative meaning of the word has changed. Of course, that's over a period of a couple hundred years. The connotative meanings of a word can change very rapidly, depending on sometimes on what the news is. Airplane one day may have one connotations, but the fact that I mentioned airplane a week after the Japanese airliner was shot down by the Russians gives the airplane a whole different set of connotations. The associated meanings, in other words, of the poem are going to change from time to time. So that's one of the reasons why a poet would go back and change what at one point must have seemed like a finished poem. Poets don't generally let their poems out until they're finished, till they're satisfied with them. And it takes a lot of work to get that satisfaction. It's hard to decide for certain where poetry actually starts. And there's a lot of arguments about whether poetry came first, or whether drama came first, or whether the short story came first. Since the short story is primarily a narrative. It depends on how you look at it. Certainly the first time some caveman almost got eaten by a saber-toothed tiger and came home, if he acted it out, put all the gestures in, then drama must have started first. But if he came back and all he kept saying was, big, and teeth, that was probably the first poem. Poems don't have to be enormously complex and intricate. We'll eventually see some poems that look just like prose, that you really couldn't couldn't separate if you just had them arranged in a line, which is the way prose always goes, instead of down the page. It would be difficult to tell whether you were really reading a line of prose or a line of poetry. In fact, there are even kinds of poetry called found poems in the late 60s, and late 50s, middle 60s. The idea that art was an interaction between the person and the object of art became very popular. So in other words, art was out there, but what you need to have art is not necessarily just a piece of art, but you have to have somebody who reacts to it and recognizes it as art. So there are people who went around finding poetry, usually in the midst of some prose of some sort. A line or two which was not intended as poetry, but which if you take it out and rearrange it on the page, becomes a poem. Now, these poems, these found poems, weren't always discovered in pieces of prose. Sometimes they would be discovered, for example, there's one called American Found Poem. And it's push hard for coin. Now, that's what's on the vending machines, on the coin return on a lot of them. Push hard for coin. The reason it's a found poem is because it, in essence, summarizes the Puritan ethic that America is built on. You've got to push hard for coin. And also, it's got some connotations, which poems always work on a number of different levels. When you read that push hard for coin and it's identified as an American found poem, and we know that it comes from the vending machine, it also has all those associations, those connotations that we have about vending machines. It also indicates not only do you have to push hard for coin, work hard, follow the Puritan ethic, but also, a lot of times when you push hard for coin, you don't get anything. I mean, those machines are always keeping people's money. So it stands as a sort of a paradigm or a framework, a comment on American life. Americans believe that if you work hard, you'll be successful, and yet in experience, you know, that doesn't always work out. When you push hard to get your coin returned, it doesn't always come back. The third term in there is a very important term, an objective means of expressing emotion. Now, you notice that the emotion, of course, is going to come up out of this side of the brain, but there needs to be some way to concretize it. In fact, another way of looking at that is if you want to stir up emotion in a person, you've got to find some concrete visual, some icon, some symbolic picture to stimulate the emotional side of the brain. So in this case, we would try to find an object which co-relates to the emotion that we want to stir up. This term comes from T.S. Eliot, whose poems we may get to about the 11th week, I suppose. And what he was talking about was concretizing emotion, giving it some physical dimension that you could hang on to, hopefully finding a thing that would stir up the emotions. And some of the best examples of it occur in McClish's poem, Ars Poetica. It's full of objective correlatives, objects that correlate to the emotion that the poet wanted to conjure up. Now, if you're really trying to write a poem that's primarily interested in aiming at people's intellect, then you don't need to have as many objective correlatives. If you want to talk about grief, you just mention grief. If you want to talk about love, you mention love. But if you want to stir up people's emotions as they read the poem, then you need to go to some concrete form. And this is what Eliot was talking about, finding the concrete objects that stand for something else. For example, now there are a lot of sensory images here, so I ought to tell you about image. If you look down at number 8, a concrete detail that appeals to the reader's senses. That's an image. You can have complex images, you can have simple images. The mention of a color can be an image, or you may have a whole scene described, and the whole scene functions as a single unit and would be an image. There's a lot of very sensory images in this poem. A poem should be palpable and mute as globed fruit. Palpable means touchable. In other words, a poem should be the way a piece of fruit is when you look at it on the table. First, you notice how many appeals to the senses we have here? Palpable appeals to the sense of touch. Mute appeals to the sense of hearing. Glowed appeals both to the eye and also a little bit to the idea of the sense of touch. So it's appealing to a number of different senses here. He's taken an object and created it in a number of different dimensions for us. He's saying that a poem here ought to work the way a piece of fruit works. It should be there. It should be there in all of its sensory presence, and it should have a meaning beyond that meaning. Dumb as old medallions to the thumb. Again, we're back to another more tactile images. That is, a poem should be silent in some ways, just the way an old medallion is silent. If you pick up an old medallion and you feel it, it has a certain quality to it that gives you meaning. A poem should work that way too. He may be talking here to some extent about the form of the poem. The way the poem is set up should work wordlessly on you. In fact, Edgar Allan Poe said that the content of poems wasn't really important at all. What was important was that a poem engendered a specific emotional response, put people in a certain mood. And he felt that the way to do that was by using sounds. So most of his poems have a heavy emphasis on sound independent of the words themselves. That would be the part that's mute, the part that you can't hear consciously, but which nevertheless works on it. The best example out of here, probably for an objective correlative, however, is down towards the end of the poem. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. In other words, you don't have to talk about grief if you just give people the image of the empty doorway. Why an empty doorway? There's nobody in it. It's empty. Someone has been in that doorway and gone. So he's talking in the empty doorway will conjure up the feelings of grief over someone who has been lost to us. And a maple leaf will have something to do with another poem that we'll look at, the Spring and Fall, to a young child. The maple leaf is an objective correlative for the grief that comes out of the fact that we grow old, that we die, that everything comes to an end, that everything has its season and then passes through its season. The maple leaf is not dead, but it's close. It's next to winter. Maple leaves, we normally think of a maple leaf. We don't usually think of the green maple leaf. The connotations of maple leaf wouldn't be green. It would be red and orange and yellow. The colors that we see in a maple leaf when it is passing in the fall from the last part of its life cycle, when it detaches from the tree and it falls to the ground. Well, that's the same thing that happens to human beings. In fact, Spring and Fall, which is by Gerard Manley Hopkins, treats this same idea in a similar way, except that he moves over to the intellectual side more. Instead of just saying, as McClish does, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf, he talks about that same grief, only using a child. Margaret, are you grieving over goldenrod unleaving? There's a term which isn't on here, and that's a coined word. Anytime that a poet makes up a word, he's coining it, using a new word. A poet's entitled to do that. A prose writer is entitled to do it, but if he does it very often, it begins to look pretentious and it tends to weaken prose. But poets, that's one of their jobs, to make up new words, new sounds, and they often do it. Are you grieving over goldenrod unleaving, the leaves coming off? Leaves, like the things of man, you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? In other words, he's saying, here's a child who seems to be feeling sad about these leaves turning color and falling off the trees. And he's surprised that the child can have those feelings about nature, just the way the feelings are about life, about artificial things, the things of man. And then he tells her that what she perceives now in the leaves is really a deeper grief. As the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder by and by, nor spare a sigh, though worlds of one would leave me alive. In other words, when you get old, you're going to have seen so many sad things that you'll walk through the world and you won't even sigh, let alone cry over the fact that the ground is covered with leaves that have fallen. Notice, one wood, one is pale. So the pale woods, things that are pale are on their way to death. So even if you walk through a dying woods, which you're walking through now, it won't affect you the way it affects you as a child, because you'll have seen sights colder than that, sights that make your skin crawl about the way life is. And you notice he has another coined word in there, leaf meal. The way the leaves have fallen off the trees, then they turn into a mealy substance on the ground. And yet you will weep and know why. See, now she's crying over the leaves falling off the tree, but she doesn't know why. But when she gets to be an adult, she'll know why. Now, no matter, child, the name, that is the name of this grief which you feel. Sorrow springs are the same, nor mouth had, nor mind expressed. It is no mouth ever had, no mouth ever spoke what this grief was, nor no mind ever expressed what this grief was. What heart heard of, ghost guessed. You notice we really got the split between the two brains there. He's saying this right logical side of the brain, the mouth, the speaking side of the brain, never knew, and the logical rational part was never able to express what the heart heard of, what the emotional side of the brain knows, what the ghost, what the spirit that everybody has guessed about the nature of life. It is the blight man was born for. It is Margaret you're born for. In other words, when she looks up at the tree, it's not the death of the trees that she's crying over, it's the death of mankind and her own personal death. She doesn't understand that quite yet because she's a child. And the poet says to her, but as you grow up, it will come to you. You'll understand what that grief is that makes you unhappy in the fall. It's the grief of recognizing your own mortality. And here's how McClish summed that whole same idea up in only two lines, where Hawkins went and extended it. There's another important thing to look at in Hawkins' poem there, beside the objective preludes that appear over McClish's poem, and I'm trying to look for the... It's on the other, oh, let's see, it's on the other side. Number 23. Another important thing beside diction is not merely the words, but the order of the words. So number 23 is the order in which the words of a poem are arranged. This is called the poem syntax. Ours is a very syntactical language. It's a word in which it's a language in which the order of words is as important as what words are placed in that order. I'm going to give you that example. I hit you is a lot different than you hit me. Or you hit John is a lot different than John hit you. The only thing that changes here is the syntax of the words. The diction stays the same. We have the same word. So the order that a poet puts the words in is going to be crucial. And what he does with the normal, what's called normal prose syntax, you notice in Hopkins' poem there, we have some lines in which lots of words have been left out. If we put some of these lines at the normal sequences, which is really what I was doing when I was stopping and reading the poem. Some of the last lines. Sorrow springs are the same. That's normal prose pattern. Nor mouth had. Now he's changed the syntax. That were in its normal prose pattern, he would have said, nor any mouth ever had this idea. Nor did any mind ever express it. Notice how I've put it back into prose? He takes some of the words out of our prose sentence and combines them, compresses them. Poetry is a little bit more difficult to read because quite often when you come to a line that you don't understand, it will be because the poet has changed the syntax of that line. There are a number of reasons for changing syntax. Where a word appears in a line, in a sentence, has a lot to do with the kind of emphasis it gets. The end of a line gets greater emphasis than the rest of a line. The beginning probably gets the second most emphasis, and the middle of the line gets the third emphasis. So where a word goes in the poem will have a lot to do with the emphasis that that particular word is going to get. For example, I am going home. I am going home. Home's the last word. Home gets heavy emphasis. Gets emphasis in a poem also has to do with a number of other things besides syntax. To go back to diction for a second, the type of word gets different emphasis. For example, verbs get more emphasis than nouns do. Nouns usually get more emphasis than adjectives do. Verbs are doing the action side. So if you take a verb, which gets a whole lot of emphasis anyway, and you take it out of its normal position and put it at the end of a line, that verb, that word is going to get double emphasis now. It's going to be a doubly important word. So if I said, instead of saying I'm going home, I said, home now I go, which you can easily do in poetry. You can change the syntax all around all you want. I've taken the verb, I've moved it to the end. The going gets a very heavy emphasis. There's another word in that line that gets an emphasis it wouldn't normally have either. Home. We don't expect home to come in the beginning. It's so far out of position, it will get a lot of attention, even though it would get even more attention if it were a verb that got stuck that far out of position. So what a poet does in his use of syntax is to arrange the words in different patterns to give them different emphasis. And again, the different emphasis determines the meaning of the poem. If home is more important in that line than going, the line is going to have a different meaning. Say if the poem were really about a place that you want to go to, and you wanted to emphasize home, you would put home in a different position in the line. If you wanted to emphasize the motion, the movement, the continual travel, then you'd want to emphasize the verbs in a poem, and you tend to move them out of position. The going is more important than the home, and we emphasize the verbs and so on. Again, this is the syntax. Syntax is more difficult in poets we're going to get to right after we do the medieval, and those are the metaphysical poets. They did a lot of changing their syntax around. Hopkins is a modern metaphysical poet. He's writing in about the 19th and 20th centuries. John Donne, whose poem is right above that, is one of the most famous metaphysical poets. And before I tell you, we take a look at him a second. Let's look at down at number 14. Number 14 hasn't got an answer up above. For some reason, when this was typed up, the things that I had crossed out that weren't supposed to go on here got put on anyway. So I'll tell you what the answers of those are, but you're not really responsible for them. An original, unexpected comparison of dissimilar objects, images, or ideas is called a metaphysical conceit. You won't need to know that for about 5 weeks. We will be getting into the metaphysical poetry that makes comparisons between things which are very widely separated. Poetry which comes more out of the right brain than out of the left brain. Poetry which is always trying to go beyond itself and show how everything in the world is interconnected. To the right brain, everything in the world is interconnected. Remember, its big thing is pattern recognition. So if you give it 2 objects, it'll connect them either by their color or their size or their shape or the fact that you met the same 2 objects at some point in your life simultaneously. But it'll find some connection to link all these things together, because that's what it does. It links things together and puts them into bigger patterns. So when we get to the metaphysical, we'll be getting back more to the right brain. John Donne was one of the metaphysical poets, and he makes a lot of comparisons in there that we might want to look at. Before we do that, number 4, an event, quality, person, or relationship functions simultaneously as itself and as a sign for something else is a symbol. A symbol is both itself and something else. Flags are symbols. They are pieces of cloth, but that doesn't stop them from standing for, say, a nation or a whole series of concepts about what a nation is. Symbols are one of the things which poets tend to manipulate pretty frequently. And symbols, if you remember, is the way the right hemisphere of the brain works. It works in icons, in symbolic pictures. Another term which you should be familiar with is number 5, exaggeration for poetic effect. And that's called hyperbole. Poets use exaggeration some of the metaphysical poets in particular use exaggeration a lot. You can see it in Donne's Go and Catch a Falling Star. Particularly down in the second stanza. Now, what this poem is about, by the way, is it's time when he was writing. People were always writing poems in order to seduce beautiful women that they could never get to. And because they were always busy trying to do that, they got a relatively low opinion of the faithfulness of women. And that's what this poem is about. Essentially what it's saying is that there is no woman who is both beautiful and faithful. And he starts out with a series of exaggerations, a series of impossible things, all of which are hyperbole. Go and catch a falling star. Of course, that's impossible. You can't catch a falling star. Get with child a mandrake root. Mandrake root was used in the Middle Ages in love potions. The reason it was used in love potions is because it has a forked root to it, which makes it look like a human being. So they assumed that if you chop that up, it would work as an aphrodisiac. And they put it out. He says, get a mandrake root with child. The link there is that it was used in love potions. You can't get a mandrake root with child. You can't make a mandrake root pregnant. It's another impossibility. It's another exaggeration. Tell me where all past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. The devil is a split hoof. So these are all, again, this is fairly close to the Middle Ages, so these images would have been instantly understandable to the people reading at the time. They wouldn't have needed these little footnotes to them. Teach me to hear mermaids singing, or to keep off envy stinging, and find what wind serves to advance an honest mind. Now remember, ship travel was travel by boat instead was done by sail. So he's saying, what wind? You need the wind to advance the ship. Tell me what wind there is that will help an honest person get ahead in the world. That's another impossibility. Setting up these series of impossibilities. Because they're impossible, they're exaggerations, they're done for effect, they're all hyperbole. Then he takes a single image and piles hyperbole, exaggeration on exaggeration. He says, even if you could do all of these impossible things, catch the falling star, get a mandrake root with child, etc., you wouldn't be able to do the thing at the end of the second stanza, find a woman true and fair. But even if you could do these first set of impossible things, and even if you had some impossible attributes yourself, if thou beest born to strange sights, things invisible to see, even if you are mystical, more mystical than other people, and can see things in the world that nobody else can see, ride 10,000 days and nights. You see the exaggeration there? 10,000 days and nights is what? That's 30 years. Even if you rode for 30 years, day and night, till age, snow white hairs on thee. Till you got, even if you rode looking until you got old and gray and never got out of the saddle, thou, when thou returnest, when you came back again after all this exaggerated looking, you would tell me all the strange wonders that you saw in this great travel, and swear nowhere lives a woman true and fair. True is faithful. So even though you could do all these magical things, even if you have second sight and can see the future and can see things that don't exist in the world, even if you traveled for 10,000 days and nights until you got old, everywhere in the world, saw all of the strange and wonderful things there are in the world, when you came back, you would tell me about those, but you'd never be able to tell me that you found a woman who was both beautiful and faithful. And then, of course, he passes out of the exaggeration in the last line. No, I'm sorry, he continues with a little bit less of an exaggeration. If you find one, if thou findest one, let me know. Such a pilgrimage were sweet. A pilgrimage, maybe, is a journey that a religious journey, a very difficult religious journey that a person makes to a holy place. So he says, if you could find a woman like that, it would be a pilgrimage, and it would be a sweet pilgrimage. Even though I had to suffer all kinds of privations to get there, to find that kind of a woman would be worth it. Yet do not tell me. Again, you can see a change in the syntax there. It hasn't filled out that complete sentence. Yet do not. I would not go. Though at next door we might meet. And here's the exaggeration coming in. Though she were true when you met her, she were faithful when you met her, and lasted faithful, nobody had been able to seduce her, until you wrote your letter, yet she will be false ere I come to 2 or 3. So he says, even if she lived next door and she was honest and faithful and nobody had seduced her when you saw her, and even if she still was when you wrote the letter, by the time I ran next door, it would be too late. Because nowhere is there a woman true and fair. Now, all through the poem, we see a continual series of exaggerations. Because, in effect, it's also a humorous poem. So poems use hyperbole. Almost anywhere in there you can find an example of it. Number 6 is 2 lines that rhyme in a row. 2 lines that rhyme in a row are called a couplet. You can find some couplets in Donne's poem. Yes, singing and stinging would be a couplet. The term isn't on there, but wind, find, wind, and mind would be either a triplet. I believe it's also called a tercet. You don't have to know that. I just thought I would throw these little terms in case you ever get any use for them. You realize nobody will ever come up and ask you to define any of these terms in your life anyway, but then on the other hand, nobody's ever going to come up to you and ask you what a squared plus b squared plus c squared is either. A lot of education is useless knowledge. It's just nice because it's nice to have knowledge to begin with. It's not of any great use. It's just inherently fun in itself. In any case, there are also a number of couplets in McClish's poem. A poem should be palpable and mute as glowed fruit. Mute and fruit, both lines rhyme. You have 2 of them as a couplet. I'm sure you've come across that before hundreds of times. Number 9. The answer to number 9, the first poet to write in English, is something that you probably ought to know. People have been writing in English now for about 2,000 years. Prior to that, even people who spoke English wrote in Latin. The first person to do it is Caedmon, C-A-E-D-M-O-N. And he was, as the rest of the definition there goes on to explain, a common herdsman, totally illiterate, who, as the story goes, was at an inn. And a common way for people to amuse themselves in medieval times was to tell stories. And when it came his time to tell a story, he couldn't talk. He just couldn't think of anything to say. And he was so humiliated by that that he left the room. He ran out. And that had been his problem all through his life. He was never really very articulate. And he went back to his room, and he fell asleep. And in his sleep, an angel appeared to him and commanded him to go back and to sing, which is the word for poetry at the time. I mean, all poetry was considered song. To go back and to sing. And when he went back, ideas that had never come into his head were suddenly there, and he was able to articulate them in a very attractive fashion. He had gone from being almost completely inarticulate to being so inarticulate that he could be a poet. A poet should be the most inarticulate, probably, person, because they have to be so precise in their selection of words and so on. So, in a sense, English poetry begins with, at least legendarily, this miracle. The poems that he started to make up and the songs that he sang were primarily about the Christian myths of creation and so on. They were primarily religious poems. But of course, most poetry at the time was religious. So he was seen. So it may not be that this really happened, but it's a nice legend. And of course, it was certainly accepted as fact when Caedmon was doing the singing, because everybody believed in miracles then, and this was just one more everybody would have been happy with. That brings in really B and C, the Anglo-Saxon and the classical traditions, which are 16 and 17, and which we'll be covering, of course, at length in the latter part of the course. Now, the classical tradition, as far as poetry is concerned, we'll learn a whole lot about classicism, about what happened with the Greeks and the Romans. But when we apply it to poetry, we'll be talking about the rhyming tradition, the tradition that originated in Greece and Rome. And the classical tradition emphasizes rhyme because Latin is a very, very easy language to rhyme in. English is pretty difficult. If you have a line that ends with the word orange, you're in big trouble, because there is no rhyme for orange in the English language. The reason for rhyme is initially, I think rhyme is in here too. it ought to be in there. Rhyme is the repetition of the end sounds of a word, like mute and fruit. When they don't quite rhyme, as they don't in song, where you have find, wind, and mind. Is 26 rhyme? No, that's rhyme scheme, a pattern of rhyme.
Patterns of rhyme and
Excuse me?
26. Patterns of rhyme and
Yes.
song.
The answer to that is rhyme scheme. It's not
Oh,
simply,
rhyme.
that's the pattern of rhymes. Rhyme itself is just the repetition of end words, like mute and fruit. And when you have find and wind, that's called an off rhyme. It's also sometimes called a slant rhyme or a sight rhyme. In other words, it looks like the words rhyme, but the sounds don't quite match up. You're entitled to those in print poetry. The use of rhyme comes about as a mnemonic. M-N-E-U-M-O-N-I-C, a memory device. The memory pegs that we were doing in the seminar is a memory device. You have to be able to remember most poetry. In fact, for the large majority of the time that poetry has been done, it's been done orally. It's been said out loud. It wasn't written down. That means it had to be remembered. One of the easiest ways of remembering things, if you have a language that rhymes easily, is with rhyme. Because if you can remember line 1, if line 2 rhymes with it, you've already got a key to line 2. So if you've forgotten line 2, all you have to do is to think back to line 1. Anglo-Saxon poetry, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which you see down in number 17 there, wasn't filled with a lot of easy rhymes. So it used alliteration. And alliteration, I can see why some of these things are on here that shouldn't be, because other things were dropped off. Alliteration is repeating the very first sound in a line. Now the Vikings used alliteration in order to tie their poems together. They would write a line of poem in which, let's say, there would be 3 words, take the first line. You have 3 words which would begin with the letter A. And then you'd have 2 words that begin with letter B, and then 3 words that begin with letter C. Line 2, 3 words that begin with letter B. 2 words that begin with letter C, 3 words that begin with letter D. Line 3, 3 C's, 2 D's, 3 F's. You can see how the pattern goes through. If you've got any one line in a piece of this kind of Anglo-Saxon poetry, you've got at least 3 other lines, because it'll tell you what lines came before and what lines are going to follow after, because the rhyme, that alliterative pattern, that repetition of the first sound in a word, is used as a memory device in order to tie lines of poetry together. Earlier poems are generally fairly long. If they're going to be remembered, we have to have mnemonic devices. And since it wasn't easy to rhyme in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, it used alliteration. You can also see under the classical tradition there that the classical tradition is primarily coming out of the left hemisphere of the brain. It emphasizes the intellect and a restrained approach to poetry. Restrained in the sense that it hasn't got a lot of emotion churning up in it. If it's about an emotional subject, it tries to give you an intellectual way to deal with that emotion. The consolations of poetry. In other words, people would write a lot of poems about losing a loved one. Not because they wanted to get into the emotion of what it felt like to lose one, but because they wanted to go past that emotion and come to some kind of consolation, some way to console themselves with an intellectual understanding of why the death has occurred. It doesn't make it any easier emotionally, but it makes it easier to cope with because you've removed it and put it into an intellectual framework. Now the Anglo-Saxon tradition, on the other hand, emphasized the emotional and the sensual approach to poetry. That comes back out again in the medieval. Anglo-Saxon tradition, again, is that tradition that I had mentioned earlier. Remember, the Greeks were lucky because they straddled those 2 cultures, the irrigation cultures of the Far East, which were structured and ordered and had bureaucracies and a large central state government, and the European tradition. Well, the European tradition is the Anglo-Saxon tradition. That's the hunters. That's the people for whom emotion and sensation are of the greatest importance, and it carries over into their poetry. Caedmon, of course, is the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. He's not really the beginning of it, he's just the first one we have left that's writing in English. Now, poems, as I pointed out, can be rhymed. The end pattern of a line, repetition of words at the end of a line and the end part of the word. But poems don't always have to be rhymed. For a long period of time, people assumed that they did. In fact, up into the 19th century, there were people who literally burning poems because they said, this is outrageous, this isn't a poem, it hasn't even got any rhyme in it. Because poets had begun to abandon rhyme. Now, they did it slowly. There's really three kinds of verse. There's rhymed verse, which generally has a fixed rhythm to it, and similar sounds at the end of the line. There's what's called blank verse, which doesn't have any rhymes, but has a very noticeable rhythm to it. It's generally it's iambic pentameter, which means 5 of a certain kind of beat in the line. You don't have to worry about that. In any case, blank verse came along and got people used to not seeing rhyme all the time at the end, but they wanted rhythm. And then along came free verse. And free verse doesn't have rhyme and it doesn't have rhythm. It's noticeable. It doesn't have consistent rhyme and rhythm. It does have a rhythm to it. All speech has a rhythm. And sometimes a free verse poem will have rhyme in it, but it won't be consistently in there. In other words, a poet doesn't have to throw rhyme away entirely if he writes free verse. Most modern poetry is free verse. An example of it would be Judith Vior's It's Hard to Be Hip Over 30. You notice that the first two poems that we looked at, in fact, the first three poems, all had rhyme in it. Now, It's Hard to Be Hip Over 30 doesn't have rhyme. What it does have a lot of in it is number 24, an indirect reference to something outside the work. Now, the answer to number 4 is allusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. There are all different kinds of allusions. The most common is a literary allusion. A literary allusion makes reference to another literary work outside of the poem itself. Using these references to other works functions as a kind of shorthand. By making reference to that poem, you conjure another poem, say, or another story, you conjure that whole story up in the mind of your reader. And it only takes you a few words to do it. Remember, the poet's art is compression, 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 trying to get as much meaning packed into a relatively small amount of words as you possibly can. Well, allusion is one way to be able to do that. You only need 4 or 5 words, maybe, or maybe 1 or 2 words, to make an allusion, a reference to something outside the work, but it'll bring in a whole other set of ideas and information. So out of 2 words, you get maybe 2 or 20,000 words worth of impact. It's Hard to Be Hip Over 30 is filled with, I guess, what are now historical allusions. In other words, or social allusions, cultural allusions. This poem makes reference to a lot of things outside the poem which were commonplace in the late 50s, early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. This is before the hippie revolution really gets going. It's sort of like maybe, I guess, 62, 63 would be a good midpoint for the kind of things that she's talking about. And she makes reference to a lot of things, again, outside the poem. All around New York, perfect girls with hairpieces and fishnet jumpsuits sit in their Art Nouveau apartments discussing things like ping pong and Rudolph Nureyev. Now, there's a allusion in every line. Allusions to the fashion. Hairpieces and fishnet jumpsuits. If you ever see a movie from, say, 1961, you see women with their hair curled up like that and lacquered and sprayed. It looked like it could move if you hit it with a hammer. That's what she's talking about. Hair, wigs. Wigs were real big then, especially these very coiffed kind of wigs. And fishnet jumpsuits. The style, the open weave sweaters, fishnet sweaters. People were wearing them all the time. Some of them, you have to remember, this is the early 60s and the sexual revolution hadn't begun. Most people were wearing them over some kind of clothing. By the end of the 60s, people were wearing the fishnet jumpsuits, if they wore them at all, without anything under them. That made a big difference. But she's really just talking about, for her, just wearing the fishnet jumpsuit with this opening, with the openings in it, even with other clothes under it, is so risque. Because she's a child of the 50s, and the 50s were enormously repressed times. So this was a very outrageous kind of thing to do. And she's comparing herself with these people who are hip. Hip isn't a word that's probably not used anymore.
Mod?
Mod, yeah, mod was another one at the time. Being, if you use the intellectual term for it is au courant, which means being in the know. And so being hip is knowing all the little underground things that the little subculture knows. Every subculture makes up its own language and its own symbols that it uses, and if you know them, then you're hip. So she's talking about people who are hip at the time. She's not hip. She's this middle-class lady who really would like to be hip, but who just doesn't know all of those things yet. Everybody else just seems to know naturally about these things, like Art Nouveau, which is an art style out of the 20s. Aubrey Beardsley, a lot of it's done in black and white. It's got a lot of flourishes and stuff in it. And it's sort of a taste, if you like that kind of art, it's sort of a taste you have to develop. Well, she's never been able to develop it. And it was in then. In other words, everybody was getting Art Nouveau stuff and putting it up so that they could be hip and they could be in. And she says, well, there are all these people doing it and I don't know how to do this. And then discussing things like King Kong. King Kong, the movie, at that time it was considered, if you could find intellectual content in movies which had apparently been done just for entertainment, as King Kong was, then you were very hip. You had better insights than other people, and you were therefore superior to them. And then they discuss things like King Kong, they talk about film and stuff, with people like Rudolf Nureyev. That's another illusion. Rudolf Nureyev was a ballet dancer at the time. In fact, he was the greatest ballet dancer there thought there had been up until that moment. In fact, I saw him dance once on film. He was amazing. Went up in the air, and he just stayed there. And then he fluttered his legs about 8 times, and then he came back down again. And I just went,
How is that an illusion, then?
it's a reference to something outside of the work. In other words, you have to know about Rudolf Nureyev to really appreciate that poem. In other words, if it hadn't been an illusion, she could have said, with people like famous ballet dancers.
Oh.
That wouldn't be an illusion. But the fact that she mentions Nureyev, and that's a reference to something outside of the work. Meanwhile, the rest of us, the non-hip people, all the mommies who stay at home in middle-class suburbia and live in Colts Neck or Rumson or whatever, or anywhere, I guess, even in Ocean Township. Meanwhile, the rest of us serving crispy critters to grouchy 3-year-olds, they don't make crispy critters anymore. They went the way of Quisp, I think. Quake is still around, but Quisp is gone. She says that's an illusion, another reference. She doesn't say serving cereal to grouchy 3-year-olds. Notice how saying crispy critters, at the time, everybody would have had the commercial for crispy critters in their head. So when she mentioned crispy critters, everybody would have known not only what she meant, but they would have had a specific kind of cereal in mind. Now that makes the poem richer than just saying feeding cereal to grumpy 3-year-olds. Because you expect even grumpy 3-year-olds to like crispy critters. I mean, everybody, the television said so. Everybody liked crispy critters. And drinking our Metrical. Now, Metrical was a diet drink at the time. It looked like very, very thick chocolate milk and tasted like very, very thick chocolate chalk. Everybody was on a diet because slim was the thing to be then. Slim is probably still the thing to be. More Americans are on a diet than probably anywhere else.
That was the age of Twiggy, wasn't it?
Yeah, oh, I think, yes, you're right. Twiggy weighed about 45 pounds and was 5'8". And she was the ideal model. She's up to about 48 now. She's chunked out a little bit. She went off. Actually, they probably, going off the drugs probably helped, and she's reached puberty now, so she doesn't any longer look like a pencil. But everybody was trying to look like Twiggy. See how crazy we are. Of course, you realize, you look back at the 60s and you can see how ridiculous everybody was. But we're all equally ridiculous today. We're all in the grip of the same kind of fads and ridiculous ideas. I mean, people are still dieting. As if you weigh more than the exact amount that you ought to weigh on the doctor's chart, which they recently revised, by the way, and added 5 or 10 pounds, it's still 20 pounds below what anybody that actual height weighs. But of course, it doesn't really matter all that much. People are still dieting. We're still doing the ridiculous things. Dream of snapping our fingers to the music. If only we knew when to snap. I mean, imagine what would happen now if you sat around snapping your fingers to the music. Everybody would think you were so weird. But at that time, hip people, but you have to remember, this is also the beginning of drugs. Hip people were also drugged, and they were. But see, the drugs then were different than the drugs now. Say, Quaaludes weren't a popular drug. I mean, there's no, people who take Quaaludes can't snap their fingers. They fall off to the side. Obviously, it's gone out of fashion. Then the big drug was alcohol. Well, you can snap your fingers with alcohol for hours before you're finally so drunk you can fall forward and hit your head on the chair. So these people were snapping their fingers. That's how they were hip. And she'd like to do that, but she can't figure out when to snap. She hasn't got any natural rhythm to it. But it's hard to be hip over 30 when everyone else is 19. And the last dance we learned was the Lindy. That's a historical reference at the time. The Lindy was a dance, I believe, in the late 30s and 40s, late 30s. So she's the last dance. So that means that she's got to be over 30 even in the 60s. Gee, that means Judith Rio's got to be about 60 now. I identify with her. I thought she was only as old as I am. This is really terrible. I'm getting older the longer I read this poem. The older I get, the end, I look like Dorian Gray, like all these women suddenly come all together at the same time. And the last we heard, girls who look like Barbara Streisand. Another illusion. Barbara Streisand is, I think, still in movies. She makes them every once in a while. She usually makes them with Ryan O'Neal. You know, they get two has-beens together and they make this film. Barbara Streisand was a very popular singer then, but she had a long nose with a hump in it in the middle of it. And before that, everybody was getting their nose straightened, made little and delicate and turned up and very, very washed, but Barbara Streisand stayed natural. And this is a new change in the culture now. Everybody's starting to look natural and she can't understand it. Last she heard, everybody who had a nose like that was trying to do something about it, get a new nose made. We long to be kicky and camp. Well, that's an even older word than groovy. Those things get extinct. Certain words get extinct. For a while they're used and then they can never be used again. Camp was a term that came out of the homosexual underground. And it meant acting so homosexual that it embarrassed everybody around you. Or doing things which were so sentimental and extreme that it was a way of being in a subculture, acting like the stereotype applied to that subculture, and then laughing behind your hand at all those idiots out there who thought you really did fit the stereotype. So camping it up was doing that, acting the way people expect you to act from their stereotypes, and really doing that as a way of mocking on them. So she longs to be kicky and camp, both of which are also illusions because they're references to words which were current at the time. But the maid only comes once a week. It's hard to be a new hippie if you only have a maid coming in, because then your place will be a mess. I mean, this is at a time when people thought that their house should be immaculate and everything were in their place, and anyone who came to your house would form an opinion of the quality of your character based on whether or not you had vacuumed recently within the last month or so. Then, of course, it was within the last hour. Everything had to be perfectly in place. And she says, well, I'd like to go off and do all these wild things, but then my house would be a mess and everybody would think badly of it. And since we have to show up for the carpool, orgiastic pot parties with cool Negroes who say funky and man seems rather impractical. In the 60s, one of the hippest things that you could be was black in the early 60s. It was the beginning of the civil rights movement and so on. And people were inviting people. This is also sort of the double image that went on in the late 50s, kind of reverse racism. People invited token black people to their parties. And of course, they were much hipper than her because they said funky gives even more than campy and kick. But it seems rather impractical to do all those things when the maid only comes in once a week and you have to go to the carpool every day. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Now that's a poem by T.S. Eliot. That's a literary allusion. It's a poem written about 1917 about disillusionment with the world. And in it you have a guy who's wandering into a party and everybody is talking about Michelangelo and all these intelligent, intellectual things, and he doesn't really fit in there. He feels alienated from that world, and it's all trivial and phony. Now, she learned this poem line by line long ago, but it doesn't swing, we are told, on East 10th Street. And East 10th Street is in the East Village, which is where that was the center of hipness in the early 60s in New York City. And she says this poem, which everybody learned to show that they were an intellectual when she was young, now everybody would laugh at it. They think it was a ridiculous poem. It doesn't swing. And swing, of course, is another 30s term. So in other words, she's showing you by using these words, which you could also see swing as an illusion, a historical illusion, by using words which were so out of date even when she wrote, she was indicating just what the poem was trying to tell you, that she was hip once, but you can't stay hip forever unless you spend your whole time at it, figuring out what is the new fad, being one of the trendy people now. Hip, that's what hip has become now. It's trendy. Or what's the other California word? Upscale. Everything is upscale, so that she's using words which are even old by the time that she's writing to indicate how out of touch she is. And again, all these are allusions of one kind or another, where all the perfect girls are switched on or tuned in or miscegenated, but never over 30, trying hard to be hip. Whatever it is they are, they're not like her struggling to be alone. Now, you couldn't have that poem unless you had all of those illusions. The poem would be weakened if it didn't make references to the culture and the history of the times. A lot of works do that. In fact, one of the things that makes maybe older works somewhat difficult is the fact that, like John Donne's poem, you could see Get With Child of Mandrake Root as an illusion. It's an allusion to witchcraft, which was commonplace at the time. Science, the closest there was to science when John Donne was writing, was alchemy. And one of the things that an alchemist did, besides spending all his time trying to turn lead into gold, was also to create filters and potions, love potions. So when somebody read John Donne's poem, as soon as he mentioned a mandrake root, love potions instantly came to mind. It was an illusion at the time. And one of the things that, again, makes poems difficult, more difficult with the passage of time, is that the illusions a poet makes, which his contemporaries would have picked up instantly, are no longer illusions which we can recognize without footnotes, which is why most of the time you do poetry, in poetry books and so on, you find that it's got all these footnotes at the bottom to explain illusions which the reader could just zip right through. A poet, in his use of illusions, has to be very careful in that he has to decide whether he wants to have contemporary impact or whether he wants universal impact. In other words, the more contemporary allusions you put into a poem, the more people are going to be able to instantly identify with it and plug into what you're saying. They're not going to have to stop and think about it. But if you put a lot of them in, exactly what happens to this poem happens. It gets dated. And it becomes difficult to understand because it is no longer describing a culture which is contemporary. So the poet has to decide, does he want to make a big impact now? Or does he want to play down that impact on the hopes that the poem will be accessible to people 100 or 1,000 years from now? Now, Donne's poem is 400 years old, and it's more or less readable still. Judith Bjork's poem in 400 years will seem like absolute gibberish, because there'll be nobody around who remembers those illusions more than likely. See what I've missed here so far. Of course, I started out that poem also to point out that it was free verse. There's no rhyme in there anywhere. In fact, we don't even have a fixed rhythm necessarily to the poem, although the stanzas, etc., seem to come out in roughly the same pattern. We don't have any rhyme in it. So this is free verse. Sometimes free verse looks just like prose. Number 11, the successive groups of lines printed as a unit is called a stanza. There are, if you look at John Donne's poem, there are 3 stanzas in that poem. You can think of a stanza as a verse paragraph, more or less, and sometimes it's also called a verse. There are 6 stanzas in Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 12 stanzas in Ars Poetica. Although you could have pushed that. Now, you could have pushed that all together and made it all one long stanza. Instead, he breaks it out into 2-line stanzas. How you break out your stanzas is very important to a poet. For example, by putting these in 2-line stanzas, what he's doing there is isolating each idea. Each idea appears in a different stanza. So he's isolated it to give it more emphasis, to If he made that all in one big stanza, those ideas would have a tendency to run together more than they do by being separated out. If you look at Donne's poem, his poem is broken into stanzas also in terms of their ideas. He has a series of impossibilities, then he has one possibility developed at length, and then he has a conclusion mixed in with another possibility. Each stanza is sort of a different topic, just the way when you probably took English 125, you were taught to break things into paragraphs in terms of whenever you went on to a new idea. Well, sometimes poets do that. And sometimes they'll mix several ideas in one stanza if they don't want the idea emphasized more than all of the others. In other words, if you've got 4 ideas, you want them all treated more or less equally, put them all in the same stanza. If you have 4 ideas and you want each one seen separately, then you put them in different stanzas. Number 12 is ambiguity. Using figurative language to create more than one appropriate meaning. Poems generally don't have one single meaning. They have numbers of meanings. They function on a lot of different levels. That's why you can take a poem apart and discuss what it means for hours and hours when the poem is only 200 words long. Because it functions on a lot of different levels. Sometimes a form of ambiguity, you might look at a pun as a form of ambiguity. A pun, when you use a word, it can mean 2 different things. You do this in order to create both an initial meaning and also to set up a confusion which is pleasing to the reader. There's 2 things that you can do, by the way, to your readers as a poet. One is you can establish patterns and then carry them out. And that will make your reader feel good because they can guess what comes next. One of the reasons why kids like nursery rhymes with the rhymes in them is because they have a sort of almost inherent grasp of rhyme anyway. They recognize repetition. And they know that there's a repetition coming. And then it comes. It's one of the first controls children really have over language. It's one of the first times that they can know, in terms of language, what's going to come next. And the manipulation of language is the thing that generally separates adults from children. Adults are much better at it. Children are just learning the language, and they learn it much more quickly than any of us learn anything. I mean, I forget how many tens of thousands of words you pick up in like 1 year of life there when you're just beginning to pick up language. But in any case, they like the repetition because you set up a pattern and then you fulfill the pattern. That sets up delight. It also may have a physiological response. Repetitions tend to use the same pathways in the brain. If you use the same pathway over and over and over, the chemicals that get put out of the synapse and then brought back in are being put out and brought back in so often that some of that chemical tends to stay out there. That makes the transmission of the nerve impulse faster, and it's a pleasing sensation. Generally, anytime your brain is able to save itself some effort, it likes it. Also, that repetition sets up chemical changes in the brain which build up certain chemicals. The buildup of those chemicals will change your brain state. Some of the repetition used in poetry, especially the repetition of sound, probably comes from one of the earliest forms of poetry, chanting. Notice how a little kid will say the same sound over and over and over and over again? That's burning the same pathways in, secreting the same brain chemicals, and certain of those brain chemicals will change your mindset, will change your state of consciousness. That was inherently pleasing to people, and gradually that form of the chant, repetition of the words over and over again, got more and more sophisticated, but repetition was still kept. That's as the chant moves out and begins to become poetry. The other thing that you can do to your reader is to set up the expectation of a pattern being fulfilled and then not fulfill it. In other words, you rhyme and you rhyme and you rhyme, and then all of a sudden you don't rhyme. Now that will also delight your reader. The reason a joke works is because a lot of jokes lead you off in this direction and then turn around and go back in the other. And it's a surprise. You're expecting a pattern to be built up, and then the pattern isn't built up after all. That will cause some delight. So this is another thing that a poet will do. Set up a pattern just in order to break the pattern. Now where you break a pattern, you're going to add heavy emphasis. Because remember, it's going to surprise the reader. Where you complete a pattern, you still get emphasis, because the reader is sort of looking ahead there going, oh, one part of the brain is looking for that, probably this side of the brain, looking for the next time that's going to come up. Remember pattern recognition? And so it gets delighted because it guessed what's coming up. Other times when you change the pattern, the other side of the brain goes, well, that was very cleverly done. We should certainly reward that by smiling, and of course then they do. So you can use both of these techniques, and that's one of the reasons why poets can use repetition. Number 13, it hasn't got an answer either. Everything, I don't know, maybe it's a good thing that those are in there. There ought to be a lot of stuff that doesn't have any answers to it. The answer to that one is ballad stanza. A 4-line stanza rhyming the first line and the third line, the second line and the fourth line, or just the second line and the fourth line, whereas XA, X usually means no rhyme. That will be important to you because you can find it in folk poetry, you can find it in hymns, and you can find it in rock and roll. A basic rock and roll stanza is rhyming every other line. And they are generally short stanzas, and they're generally 4 lines to the stanza. So that pattern is probably the most common pattern that you'll see today. Who uses it? Bob Dylan used it an awful lot. Billy Joel uses it a lot. A ballad pattern. So does Bruce Springsteen, I think. Yeah, Bruce Springsteen is another ballad writer. He will tend to use that rhyming pattern. Number 14, didn't have an answer, but I gave you that anyway, metaphysical conceit. A conceit just means a conception. But we'll get to that when we get to the medieval and metaphysical and so on. Bestowing human traits on something non-human is personification, treating it as if it were a live thing. And of course, that's something that poets do very frequently. Classical and Anglo-Saxon tradition we've covered. Dramatic monologue. Dramatic number 18. A poem in which a fictitious or historical character, caught in an important moment of his life, speaks to one or more characters who remain silent. In other words, all we have is like a poem that's one side of a telephone conversation. The person speaks on at length as if they were talking to the reader or somebody who was actually present. Generally, it's a narrative of some sort about what's going on. The most famous is Browning's My Last Duchess, in which the poet, which the speaker in the poem, and we have to make a distinction, it's not on here, but there's a difference between the speaker in the poem, or the voice, and the autobiographical poet. In other words, even when a poet writes a poem in which the word I is used, he is not necessarily referring to himself personally, or herself personally. That I is a voice, a persona, a mask that's adopted. The poet is writing as if he were a person, not necessarily himself. The person may be like himself. In fact, sometimes the person corresponds directly with the autobiographical poet. But generally, the speaker in a poem isn't necessarily the author himself. Now, in a dramatic monologue, it's almost never the author himself. In Browning's My Last Duchess, the guy who does the talking in the poem is a nobleman. And he's talking to a person who you find out through the poem is a representative of a rich family who has been sent there to arrange a marriage between this duke and somebody's daughter. And as he's going around, he shows them all these paintings, and he's talking about the painting, and he says, "That's my last duchess on the wall." And he says, "You see the smile that she has, how beautiful she is with that smile? That smile was for everybody. Everybody could make her smile. Somebody brought her flowers from the garden, she smiled. She smiled at them the same way she smiled at my gift of a 400-year-old name. I gave commands, all smiling stopped." She died. She couldn't live without smiling. And now he's looking for a new wife to marry. And you get the feeling that the speaker in the poem is revealing himself as he describes this particular moment. And the reader of the poem gets a different version, generally, of the speaker than the speaker has of himself. It's a very complex form. It's very similar to why it's called dramatic monologue. It's very much like drama. It's like the soliloquies in a Shakespeare play where the guy stops and just talks at length, to be or not to be, etc. It's that kind of a poem, only taken out of the context of a play and standing completely by itself. Usually it's usually a narrative, it usually tells a complete story in itself also. Modern arrangement of words into clusters, usually spoken in one breath. Surprisingly enough, those are called breath groups. That's a way of breaking them out. If you look at the invention of New Jersey, you'll see in that. Place a custard stand in a garden. Or in place of a custard stand, place a tumble-down custard stand. See how those words would normally be said as a whole unit? Well, if you break the poem out into those whole units, you're functioning using breath groups. And most modern poetry is free verse, it doesn't rhyme, and it's generally blocked out into breath groups. Number 20, a comparison using like or as or than is a simile. Usually when people remember any terms from poetry, it's a simile because all they have to do is look for like or as or than. If that states the two, so as soon as you see like as or than, you know two things are being compared. In a metaphor, two things are also being compared, but you don't have any little clue that that's what's going on. Number 21 shouldn't even be in there. A long, heroic narrative poem found in both Anglo-Saxon and classical traditions. That's the epic. And when we do the classical medieval segment, we'll be doing epics and how they differ. Also, if you go on from this course and take world literature, you will read an epic or two epics in there with Professor Hayden. Number 22, running the sense of a line over into the next line is called enjambment. You are jamming one line into another. Ars Poetica has it in. A poem should be palpable and mute as globed fruit. You notice how the sense runs over from the first line into the second. You would call that an enjambed line. If the poem, some poems, however, at the end of each line, that's where the sentence ends. That's where the sentence ends. That wouldn't be an enjambed line. Syntax we've already covered. Allusion we've already covered. Assonance is the repetition of similar or identical vowel sounds within the word. That really probably, alliteration should have been in there in place of assonance. Alliteration, you repeat the first sound of the word. Assonance, you repeat sounds in the middle. And assonance is usually vowel sounds, by the way. Usually if you're repeating like B's and P's and T's and D's, that's called consonants. But that's not all that important. That's not one of the most important words there, but the answer to that is assonance. And then number 26, the answer, of course, is rhyme scheme, the pattern of the rhyme. If you look at song, Go and Catch a Falling Star, the rhyme scheme in that, normally the first time you come to a rhyme, you call that rhyme A. So in other words, if we put an A after star, the next rhyme isn't A, so it's B. Root is B. R rhymes with star, it's A. Foot is supposed to rhyme with root. It's an off rhyme. It's a visual rhyme, a sight rhyme. That would be B. Singing doesn't rhyme with either of the two, so that would be C. Singing rhymes with singing. That would be C. Fine, wind, and mine don't rhyme with anything before, so they'd be all D's. The rhyme scheme in Dunt's poem would be A, B, A, B, C, C, D, D, D. And you'll find a similar pattern, first and third, 2 in a row, 3 in a row, in the other stanzas as well. That's the rhyme scheme. One of the things I'd like you to look at for the seminar, when we discuss the poem, is see if you can find the rhyme scheme in Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. You'll notice that there is not just repetitions in there, but that certain lines are repeated as well. Try to identify them. Another important thing for poems is their form. And the form, which is a term which ought to be on here and isn't, form is the overall pattern of a poem. How many stanzas it has, how many lines are in each stanza, what kind of rhyme scheme it has, if any. Those are all matters of form. Form is also how the poem is laid out on the page. Remember, it's poetic form, which is really the most easily distinguishable from prose. Because when we look at a prose, it goes all the way across the page. All the lines go all the way across the page except the first and last lines in a paragraph. That's prose form. Poetic form, the lines may or may not go all the way across the page. There used to be other elements of poetic form like commas and so on. Typography, how the poem is set out on the page. Even as far back as the 15th century, people were laying out poems in shapes. And how they laid out the poem. The shape of the poem itself would have a comment on what the poem was about. Spreading the word all over the page, spreading the poem all over the page, presented another dimension to the poem. In other words, the poem was important for what it said, for the sounds that it made when you hear those words echoed in your head, and also for the visual impact that it makes. For example, Refroffisager, the poem by E.E. Cummings down there. Now you notice that looks like he just sort of took the words and scattered them anywhere they want. And one of the things that Cummings did as a poet was to write poems which were intellectual puzzles. All of the content of the poem said to people, don't listen to your left hemisphere, listen to your right side of your brain. Go with your emotions, go with your feelings. He wrote poems aimed at people who were intellectuals. And what he said throughout his poems continually was, the intellect will not tell you the truth. The real truth only comes through intuition, through the emotion. So in order to sucker the intellectuals into reading that set of statements, he made poems which were intellectually challenging. They were all little puzzles, as is this poem. To read this poem right, you have to rearrange the letters and the words. The poem really comes down to being grasshopper. That's the first word there. Who, as we look up, now gathering. If you've ever seen a grasshopper, first of all, they're kind of awkward anyway. And then when they go to jump, they sort of all collapse in on themselves, and then they fly through the air. When a grasshopper flies through the air, it's not real graceful. It sort of tumbles over itself almost, and arms and legs stick out. Just the way this poem is, sort of collapsed and then spread out, sticking out and awkward all over. Grasshopper who, as we look up now, gathering, if you skip down the line, gathering together the grasshopper, leaps, arriving, rearrangingly, to become grasshopper. The poem then reads, grasshopper who, as we look up now, gathering together the leap, arriving, the leap to arrive, arriving to be, arriving to become, rearrangingly grasshopper. You find that become by looking at the stuff in the parentheses. And of course, notice how the leap spreads out across the page. A lot of times when E.E. Cummings would write the word fall, the A and the two L's would each drop down a line. He was continually trying to create visual impressions with his poetry as well as the intellectual impressions. Now, what I'd like to do for the seminar then is to see if you can find the rhyme scheme on Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, and see if you can answer 27, 28, 29, 30, and 31 at the bottom of that page. That's what we'll be doing in the seminar when we meet at, this class meets at 12:30 next week. Anybody have any questions? I guess that's it then. The flag with a symbol and all sorts.
Then what happens to F allusion?
Allusion is number 24.
But I think it's going to get that.
The answers, to review the answers on that sheet then, number 1, denotation, I. Number 2, connotation, H. Number 3, objective correlative, W. Number 4, symbol, M. Number 5, hyperbole, K. Number 6, couplet, R. Number 7, diction, D. Number 8, image, L. Number 9, Kedman, A. Number 10, P, free verse. Number 11, stanza, N. Number 12, G, ambiguity. Number 13 has no answer at the top, it's ballad stanza. Number 14 has no answer at the top, that's metaphysical conceit. Number 15 is personification, S. 16, classical tradition, C. 17, Anglo-Saxon tradition, B. 18, dramatic monologue, U. 19, breath groups, T. 20, simile, V. 21 has no letter, epic. 22, enjambment, J. 23, syntax, E. 24, allusion, F. 25, assonance, Q.